4 years, he thought he had it all under control, slipping away to her bed whenever his wife left town, certain his secret was safe. But one night, she decided to rewrite the rules, and his carefully hidden life unraveled in ways he never saw coming. Mark was a man who thrived on routine. He woke at 6 a.m. every day, sipped his coffee while scanning emails, and headed to his office in downtown Seattle by 7:30. He was a senior accountant, respected for his precision and reliability. His wife, Laura, a pharmaceutical sales rep, traveled frequently for work, often gone for days at a time. They had been married for 12 years, their life a well-oiled machine of shared responsibilities and quiet evenings. To everyone who knew them, they were the picture of stability. But Mark had a secret, one he guarded with meticulous care. Whenever Laura was away, Mark spent his nights with Emily. Emily was a graphic designer who lived in a small apartment across town. They met 3 years ago at a local bar during one of Laura's business trips. Emily was vibrant, unattached, and drawn to Mark's understated charm. Their connection was immediate, fueled by the kind of chemistry that made Mark feel alive in a way his marriage no longer did. What started as a one-night fling became a regular arrangement. When Laura was home, Mark was the dutiful husband. When she was gone, he was someone else entirely. Mark justified it to himself easily. Laura's trips were frequent, sometimes lasting a week or more. He told himself he wasn't hurting anyone. Emily knew he was married and never pressed for more. She seemed content with their stolen nights, their conversations over cheap wine, and the way they could escape into each other without strings. Mark was careful. Never a text sent to the wrong phone, never a trace of Emily's perfume on his clothes. He prided himself on his discipline, his ability to keep his two lives separate. Emily, for her part, played her role well. She didn't ask about Laura or push Mark to leave her. She kept their encounters light, almost transactional, though there were moments when her eyes lingered on him a little too long, or her laughter carried a hint of something deeper. Mark noticed but chose to ignore it. He told himself she understood the deal. It was just physical, a release, a way to fill the quiet when Laura was gone. This went on for 3 years without a hitch. Laura would announce her next trip. Mark would nod and wish her safe travels, and as soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, he'd text Emily. They'd meet at her place, never his. He'd leave before dawn, slipping back into his life as if nothing had happened. Laura never suspected a thing. She was busy, consumed by her career, and Mark's steady presence was something she took for granted. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was functional. They still laughed together, still shared meals, still planned for a future that neither questioned. But Emily was growing restless. She never said it outright, but the weight of their arrangement was starting to press on her. She was 32, single, and while she told herself she was fine with being Mark's escape, there were nights when she lay awake after he left, wondering what it would be like to have him stay. She started noticing small things, how he always checked his phone before leaving, how he never mentioned her to anyone, how their time together was always on his terms. She didn't want to admit it, but she was falling for him, and the realization made her uneasy. One evening in late October, Laura was preparing for a 5-day conference in Chicago. Mark watched her pack, his face a mask of calm as they discussed her itinerary. She kissed him goodbye, promising to call when she landed. As soon as her taxi disappeared down the street, Mark texted Emily. "Free tonight?" Her reply came quickly, "Come over." He smiled, already anticipating the familiar rhythm of their night. When he arrived at Emily's apartment, she greeted him with her usual warmth, but there was something different in her demeanor, a sharpness in her gaze, a slight edge to her smile. They talked over glasses of Merlot, the conversation light at first. She asked about his day, his work, the usual small talk that eased them into the night. But as the hours passed, Emily grew quieter, her responses shorter. Mark noticed but didn't press. He assumed she was just tired. They moved to her bedroom, the routine familiar. But afterward, as Mark reached for his clothes, Emily didn't roll over and drift to sleep as she usually did. Instead, she sat up, pulling the sheet around her, and looked at him directly. "Mark," she said, her voice steady, "we need to talk." He froze, one arm halfway through his shirt. "About what?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, though his pulse quickened. "About this. Us." She gestured vaguely between them. "I can't keep doing this like it's nothing." Mark sat back down on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. He'd always assumed Emily was fine with their arrangement. She'd never complained, never asked for more. "What do you mean?" he said, buying time. "I mean I'm not just some side piece you can pick up and put down whenever Laura's out of town," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I have feelings, Mark. I didn't plan on it, but I do. And I need to know if this is going anywhere." He stared at her, caught off guard. This wasn't part of the deal. "Emily, you know my situation," he said carefully. "I'm married. I thought we were on the same page." "We were," she said, her eyes narrowing. "But things change. I'm not asking you to leave Laura tomorrow, but I need to know if there's a chance for us. Something real." Mark's stomach twisted. He cared about Emily, more than he'd ever admitted to himself, but leaving Laura wasn't something he'd ever considered. His life with Laura was stable, predictable. Emily was a spark, a thrill, but not a future. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, to defuse the moment, but Emily cut him off. "Don't," she said. "Don't give me some half-assed excuse. I want the truth. Do you see a future with me? Or am I just convenient?" He hesitated, and that hesitation was all she needed. Her face hardened. "Right," she said, standing and pulling on a robe. "I think you should go." "Emily, come on," he said, reaching for her, but she stepped back. "No, Mark. I'm done being your secret. You need to figure out what you want, because I'm not waiting around anymore." He left her apartment that night feeling a mix of guilt and relief. Guilt because he knew he'd hurt her. Relief because he thought maybe this was the clean break he needed. He told himself it was for the best. Emily deserved more, and he wasn't going to leave Laura. He drove home, convincing himself he could go back to normal. But Emily wasn't done. The next day she sent him a text. "We're not finished talking. Meet me tomorrow night. My place. 7. Mark stared at the message, debating whether to respond. He didn't want to drag this out, but something in her tone made him uneasy. Against his better judgment, he agreed. When he arrived at her apartment the following evening, Emily was waiting with a calmness that unnerved him. She poured them both a drink and sat across from him at her small kitchen table. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice measured. "I don't want to ruin your life, Mark. I don't want to be that person. But I also don't want to be erased." "What are you saying?" he asked, his throat dry. "I'm saying I'm done being invisible," she said. "I've spent 3 years fitting into your schedule, your rules. I'm not doing that anymore. So here's the deal. Either you tell Laura about us or I will." Mark's heart stopped. "You're not serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," she said, her eyes locked on his. "I'm not trying to destroy you. I just want you to be honest, for once. You can't keep living like this, Mark. It's not fair to me, to Laura, or to you." He tried to reason with her, to explain that telling Laura would ruin everything. His marriage, his reputation, his carefully constructed life. But Emily wasn't budging. "You have until Laura gets back," she said. "That's 3 days. If you don't tell her, I'll send her everything. Texts, photos, the works." Mark left her apartment in a daze. For the next 2 days he was a wreck. He barely slept, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. He thought about calling Emily's bluff, but he knew she wasn't bluffing. She had enough evidence to back up her threat. Texts he'd been careless about early on, photos they'd taken on a whim during one of their nights together. He cursed himself for not being more careful. He considered his options. He could tell Laura himself, control the narrative, maybe salvage something. But the thought of facing her, of admitting what he'd done, made him sick. He could try to talk Emily out of it, but she'd made it clear she was done negotiating. Or he could leave, disappear, start over somewhere else. But that was a fantasy. He had a career, a home, a life he couldn't just walk away from. On the third day, with Laura due back that evening, Mark made a decision. He couldn't let Emily destroy his life. He drove to her apartment, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. When she opened the door, she looked surprised but let him in. "I'm here to talk," he said, his voice tight. "I don't want this to end badly." She nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I don't either," she said. "But I meant what I said. I'm done being your secret." They talked for hours, the conversation raw and unfiltered. Mark admitted things he'd never said out loud, that his marriage had felt empty for years, that Emily had been away to feel something again, that he was terrified of losing everything. Emily listened, her expression softening but not wavering. She told him she'd fallen for him, that she'd tried to keep it casual but couldn't anymore. She wanted a real relationship, not stolen moments. By the end of the night, Mark was exhausted, his defenses worn down. He agreed to tell Laura, not because he wanted to, but because he knew Emily would follow through on her threat. He left her apartment with a plan. He'd sit Laura down that night, confess everything and face the consequences. When Laura got home, she was tired but happy to see him. They ate dinner, and Mark's stomach churned with every bite. Finally, after she'd finished telling him about her trip, he took a deep breath and said, "Laura, there's something I need to tell you." Her face changed, the warmth fading as she sensed the weight in his voice. He told her everything about Emily, about the past 3 years, about how it started and why he kept going back. He didn't sugarcoat it, didn't make excuses. He braced himself for her reaction, expecting tears, anger, maybe even a demand that he leave. But Laura didn't react the way he expected. She sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. When he finished, she didn't yell or cry. Instead, she looked at him and said, "I've known for a while." Mark stared at her, stunned. "What?" "I'm not stupid, Mark," she said, her voice calm but cold. "I noticed things, your mood when I'd leave, the way you'd get cagey about your phone. I didn't know her name, but I knew there was someone." "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I didn't want to lose you," she said simply. "I thought if I ignored it, it would go away. But it didn't, did it?" They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Laura stood and walked to the bedroom. "I need time to think," she said. "But don't assume this means we're okay. I don't know what I'm going to do yet." Mark spent that night on the couch, his mind reeling. Laura had known. All this time she'd known, and he'd been fooling himself into thinking he was in control. The next morning, Laura was gone before he woke up, leaving a note that she'd be staying with her sister for a few days. Over the next week, Mark tried to reach her, but she didn't respond. He didn't contact Emily either. He didn't know what to say. He went to work, went through the motions, but he felt like a ghost in his own life. When Laura finally came home, she sat him down and laid out her terms. She wasn't ready to end their marriage, but things were going to change. No more secrets, no more lies. She wanted them to see a counselor, to figure out why their marriage had gotten to this point. And she wanted him to cut off all contact with Emily. Mark agreed, though he wasn't sure if he was doing it for Laura or to save himself. He texted Emily one last time, telling her it was over and asking her not to contact him. She didn't respond, and he didn't know if that was a relief or a loss. Life went on, but it was different. Mark and Laura started counseling, and it was harder than he expected. They talked about things they'd avoided for years. Her long hours, his resentment, the distance that had grown between them. Some days it felt like they were making progress. Others it felt like they were strangers. Mark never heard from Emily again. He didn't know if she'd moved on, if she was angry, or if she regretted pushing him to confess. Sometimes he'd drive by her apartment building, half expecting to see her, but he never did. He told himself it was better this way, that he'd made the right choice. But late at night, when Laura was asleep beside him, he'd lie awake, wondering what might have been if that one night with Emily hadn't changed everything.